All right, and welcome back for another session with James Wright. We're going to be discussing his latest book, Agile Principles for Business. And today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, the Lean and Agile Primer. So what would you like to start off with from this chapter?
Well, I'm sorry, this is probably the most boring chapter in the book. We did have to do some definitions, and this chapter made us do it. So I think that the best place to start is with Lean, because Lean's kind of the foundation for Agile. And
well, I did have one thing that I wanted to talk about. So at the very, very beginning of the chapter, you had this quote: "Agile is the ability to create and respond to change." I know that quote is probably not going to sit well with a lot of executives because it doesn't say anything about the speed of development. So,
well, yeah, I would call it a misconception. I would think that about 75% of the companies that implement Agile transformation do it to improve the speed of delivery of their software development. And my argument, I think I put it in the book, is that if you seek only for speed, you will not find it. Maybe you might get a 10% improvement, but speed is the result of doing everything else. Designing better, evaluating better, organizing better, delegating, empowering people to make decisions on their own, all that kind of stuff, right? Remember the thing we came up with in a previous one of these podcasts is that the best way to define Agile is two ways. One is distributed accountability, and the other is the ability to make decisions upon the latest information as you go, right? Yeah. It'd be nice if I had thought about that when I was writing the book to make it that simple. But if you only think about speed, then you're going to do some very non-Agile things. You're going to try to abbreviate the planning process. You're going to make maybe some cuts in how much you should be testing. You should be you won't be spending so much time in the evaluation process. There won't be they won't understand why do I have to go to a review meeting? That won't speed up delivery. Well, yeah, it activates the accountability that makes everything work. It's one of those things where if you try to just work on that one thing, you may never get it. And speed is a result. Now, I believe in the next chapter we get into kind of the process of how it all works, but it's quite possible that you may not get the speed, but you might get your product built right, and you might make your customers 10 times happier. Would you be upset if your product got delivered at the same time frame, but it was 10 times better? I don't think anybody would be too upset about that.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that I tend to run into is that this idea of we're going to make things faster sort of becomes the primary focus of how we're going to, think about this an Agile transformation. And I always try to remind people that, speed is one of those things that comes with proficiency, right? The more proficient the developers become with working in the platform that they're actually building, the faster it's going to seem like they're building things, but they're not necessarily building things faster, right? They're not writing code faster. Their fingers are not actually moving any faster. They're just, if you're doing it right, they're thinking more about the product that needs to be built in terms of how can I deliver something that's going to be valuable to the customer? And that seems like it's faster delivery, but it's not actually faster delivery. It's more relevant delivery when the customer needs it.
Yeah, if you want to if you want to learn how to do fast delivery, then you should be reading the book about the Lockheed Skunk Works during World War II. It took a bunch of people and they built an airplane from nothing into a plane where somebody's actually sitting in the plane, flying it in less than 50 days. And then that plane made a big difference in the war, right? And what do? You take your engineers and you move them to the airport and they sleep in the cots at the airport. And you tell them something like, if you're not successful, we lose the war and you lose all your freedoms. Along the way, though, they implemented a lot of agile techniques, right? They did tons of validated learning. They had the accountability for the success and the freedom to make all the design changes they needed to. They had tons of resources available to them at their fingertips to get what they needed. Now I say tons, but that's, kind of literally there were tons of metal there, but they had what they needed.
Yeah.
If we wanted to implement that today, I would guess if you wanted to make a product for a big customer, you would take all your software developers and put them in the customer's warehouse, lock them in the room and say, come out when it's ready. And here's all the tools and all the support you need. That's not really agile. It's kind of, in some ways it is, but in many ways it's more like, some kind of a torture process, right? You can't leave until you can't have your freedom until you're done.
Mm-hmm.
Seeking for speed, you might make a lot of shortcuts in a lot of the wrong places. And again, later we talk about how you can't have everything, and it's better if you pick quality over speed. I mean, if you hurry up to make the wrong product, that's really kind of a waste, and that's definitely anti-lean. You want to make the right product and use the time that you have to get that done.
Yeah, and I think that's the critical piece of this, is that there is no speed. There's no speed in agility. It's the illusion of speed because of the way that teams are able to rapidly prototype and respond to the things that the customers are saying they need, and the interpretation of metrics that are gathered because of the way the product owner is interacting with stakeholders and customers, and the way that the platform is being monitored. Like,
what you're saying is that it looks like speed because now there's visibility on what's happening.
Right.
Well, that just means that the management isn't paying attention,
yeah,
or cares to pay attention. And again, it's part of Agile is shifting management to leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And if they stay just management, then they won't really know what's happening.
Yeah,
and they won't really get the benefits either, as we'll go into a lot of details later in the book.
All right, so I interrupted you at the beginning, and you were going to say something about the differences between lean and agile, I think.
Well, some people would say it's a difference without a distinction. Other people would say they're two completely separate things. I'm kind of in the middle, right? Lean is a set of principles, elimination of waste, incremental improvement, measuring against perfection, that kind of stuff. I would say the most important of the concepts in that whole thing is the whole pull instead of push.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can't have Agile unless you have at least some lean. The whole pull instead of push is a main thing inside of Agile. I don't have it as a principle, but if you look at the list of 12 principles, that fits in several different places. Right? You can't have accountability if people are pushing stuff on you all the time, for example. And again, you can use the simple metaphor about it's easier to pull a rope than it is to push it. But lean is pretty basic in concept. To implement it, fully, you're going to do a lot of math because you have to do a lot of validated learning. And usually in a lean environment, you're looking at manufacturing processes. So there's a lot of statistics and things going on. And that's where the whole Six Sigma thing came from.
Mhm.
I remember when Six Sigma first came out, they said, do you know what Six Sigma is? And I said, well, I know that six is a Roman numeral, and I know that sigma is a Greek letter. I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, well, it's using, statistics and math to help, learn what's happening. I said, well, my degree's in economics, so I don't need a class to teach me how to use stats. I use them all the time with or without it. That's my cynical, joking nature. But the concepts are pretty basic. You run an experiment, you gather the data, you evaluate the data, you make a change. I don't know, for those that understand the scientific method and how math works, I don't know that you need a 3-day class on it. I do know that when we were at iOmega, we went through this big Six Sigma transformation thing. And we went to a presentation one day where all of our Six Sigma black belts and green belts made a presentation, and it was like going to a science fair project. They all had these, big poster boards that said, I looked at this and I got this and here's the result. And I started adding up all the math and found out that if they're all correct, our company would be bankrupt if it wasn't for Six Sigma. They found something like $300 million of saved cost. Well, our profit that year is like 105 million. So I thought we'd be 200 million in the red if it wasn't for this. And their projects all seemed kind of like on the periphery of what was really important. So that didn't seem to make sense to me. A lot of people have difficulty separating the signal from the noise in ongoing operations. It would be hard to believe that if you didn't have a Six Sigma project, that somebody wouldn't be working to make an improvement in their work, right? You can't. It's that the null hypothesis there, I think, was incorrect. They're saying if we didn't do anything, we wouldn't have this improvement. Well, if we didn't have anything, then we would have hired someone to do your job and fired you. So a lot of the hypotheses in some places are incorrect. A lot of the assumptions are incorrect. I mean, I'm not going to criticize the effort of people to use validated learning to improve their work environment and save cost. But just like, Agile, nothing's a real panacea to fix everything.
Mhm.
And, the one thing I have to say is that the first thing that entered my mind as I left that 4-hour meeting was, we just had 2,000 people in a 4-hour meeting. There's got to be some waste in there. Right? That would have been a really nice email that I could look through in 10 or 15 minutes.
Yep.
So you just have, now I suspect the reason why they had the big thing was to try and, psych everybody else up to get involved, but we just have to be careful overall how we implement stuff. Our true lean friends would say that, even if we wasted a piece of paper, like Machusta said, well, we just increased the cost to our customers by that much. And I really like the quote I included from a non-lean advocate. He's actually an expert in education. He said, it has to be an awfully good meeting to beat having no meeting at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we implement things, we have to make sure that we use some reason and some wisdom in how we implement, not just do what they teach us in a class or what they hear in a podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, the way that I look at the overlap between lean and agile is that agile seems to be, I mean, other than the fact that there was like 60 or 70 years between when each of these things were sort of recognized. But the agile seems to be a way to state the core philosophy of lean in terms that software engineers can understand.
Let's see, if I had to simplify it, I would say that lean is a way to eliminate the waste in an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And agile is a way to improve the planning and execution of planned work.
Mhm.
Making a car is sure, they're all value streams, but making a car is a process, and it comes in one side and pops out the other. Either it pops out as a working car, or it pops out as trash, or it fills up the warehouse, and then the parts just kind of fall out the windows on the other side. But something comes in and something comes out. If you want to talk about software development, there's no guarantee anything pops out. People could just go into work and futz around and nothing happens. Like, there are a whole lot of stories about that. So while it is, we could say a process, I would say it's a creative endeavor that may or may not produce anything.
Yeah.
Agile helps us make sure that we produce something of value. So, I think the lean people might get upset if I say that, oh, it's just for process, that's all. The lean people also believe that they're doing it to try and make the right product for the right customer, because making the wrong product is a waste, and they're trying to eliminate waste. Like, that's how the lines get kind of blurry.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, I don't care, because I care about the underlying principles. And for the two, lean and agile, they're the same set.
Yeah.
I mean, the only real, I would say, you take the 12 principles I define in agile, then you would maybe have an additional 3 or 4 for lean, and there you go. You got like 16 for the whole thing.
Yeah. So I like that you brought up value streams, because that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. How important is it to define your value stream, and how do you go about? You kind of go into it in this chapter. I think there's about a paragraph and a half, maybe, devoted to kind of explaining at a high level how you go about identifying a value stream. But why would you want to do that, and how do you do it?
Well, value stream mapping is one of the most fun things to do as an agile coach, because you get to get a bunch of people in a room. There's this whole kind of sub discipline called big room planning. But the idea is you get people in the room, you sit down and say, okay, now what does it take to start? Where does our process start? Where does it end? What are the things in between? How do we move from what are the steps? How to move from one step to the other? How long does it take in each step? And when it comes to things like manufacturing, it's pretty straightforward. The material comes in here, it gets inspected, it gets reviewed, it gets prepped, it goes into this machine, it gets added to stuff over here, and it goes over into that machine, and it gets assembled over here. And for a portion of my life, I worried about that, because I built things on an assembly line. Well, I didn't. Other people did. They were my products. Of course, I went on the assembly line to learn about how to work. But when I was on the assembly line, it was the foreman's assembly line, and I was just there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or I should say, foreperson. She would be upset if I called her a man. She was awesome. So when you look at the process or the value stream in a business environment, usually people do it wrong because they don't include all the stuff that's really involved, like how the budgets get approved or how the strategic decisions get made. And that's really where the biggest delays tend to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Management gets an idea about a product, they mull it over for 3 months, and then they say, get it out as fast as you possibly can. And I talk about that, I think, in the next chapter, about how to speed up, the whole thing, get to the customer as fast as you can with the ideas, so you can start the validated learning process. So when it comes to value stream mapping, the most important thing is to really pull everything into it. The big example that Womack uses in his book, I should say Womack and Jones, in their book, is you making can of Coke, right? Most people would just say you take the can, you shove the Coke in, and it pops out the other end. But when they do the value stream evaluation, they go back to the bauxite mine in Australia, where they pull the ore out of the ground, and then it has to be refined, and then they stick it on a on a ship and it goes to, I think, Norway, to a place where they, turn it into the aluminum sheets, and then it goes to the fabricator that turns it into the cans, and it gets shipped to the bottling place where they put the drink into it. Obviously that might sound kind of dumb. What is the supermarket doesn't care about all that. All they care about is, do they get their stuff on time? But if there's a problem in Australia where they can't pull the stuff out of the ground, then you can't put the Coke into the cans, and you don't get your stuff in your supermarket in in York.
Yeah.
So the same thing goes with every process, whether it's software or advertising or customer support. You have to look at the entire value stream. It's not, let's talk about customer support, because that doesn't really get much time when you talk about Agile. You might think about it from the standpoint of the phone call goes in, or the processes until the customer's thing is resolved. Well, you have to think about the people who provide the manuals and the material and the training for the people on the customer support group, which means you have to think about the product release. You have to think about the product management involved. You have to think about the sales information that has to be provided to those people. You have to think about the IT that supplies the equipment they use, the whole thing, right? Because if any of those suppliers don't deliver that component to the customer support group, they can't do their job. So the value streams are usually much, much larger than people initially think. And if you don't consider that, you're going to make big mistakes.
So how do we tell the difference between something that matters in the value stream and something that doesn't matter?
Well, the simple answer is usually it all matters. So I'm going to show my ignorance here. I know there's some terminology for it, but and I probably used to know it, but anything that can cause a bottleneck is something you have to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, let's talk about customer service for a minute. What if the tool they use to keep track of information on the customers and what they have, what if their software that they're using isn't good enough? Well, then a little thing like budgeting for a new software purchase and evaluating which application to get, well, that becomes a critical piece. Mm-hmm. And probably not too many people would think about that as part of the value stream. But if you ever have a customer service person say, well, I'm not sure what version of the application you have, or I'm not sure what product you have, can you please tell me? Well, that turns into a piece of waste that could have been eliminated if the application was up to date and the customer information was up to date. Yeah. Because customers are usually pretty bad at knowing what serial number they have, or what version of the application, or what model number they have.
So we kind of talked a little bit already about the differences between Lean and Agile, but what do you think the boundaries are there that we need to be aware of and try to help our clients stay aware of? Does it even matter if they cross the boundaries? Can we blend things and like?
Well, I would just, yeah. So this is a topic that I find myself criticizing others at the same time I'm doing it myself. I'm taking the underlying principles in the kind of well-defined Agile environment, and then I'm applying them very broadly. But I criticize others for tossing around the term Agile and Lean for things. For example, portfolio management. There's this very well-known term, Lean portfolio management. Well, I've read the documentation people provide for that. My first question is, why is that Lean? And they might come back and say, because we're pulling, we're not pushing. And I said, well, so does that mean that the tow truck is Lean when it pulls my car, to the shop to get fixed? And of course, once I make that, I'm seriously thinking, oh, someone's going to read my book and say, well, James, you say business is Agile just because it uses accountability. And so I think the answer to the question is a simple one. I think the boundaries really don't matter. again, is it lean? Is it agile? I don't know. Does it take care of your customer? Does it make your employees better? Does it, provide the benefits we're looking for? Is it based upon, basic principles? Then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
However, I would caution people to avoid throwing the words around, because then the words will stop losing all of their meaning. I think I argue many times in the book that I don't like the term agile. It's, that the word agile kind of means flexible, but agility, business agility, as we talk about, is so much more than that. And I would love it if somebody came up with a better term for us to use. I throw out the idea of distributed accountability, but that's only kind of half of the primary aspect of what we're talking about. So maybe we should just borrow a word from another language and change it around a little bit and coin a new term altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to specifically answer your question, I don't think the boundaries matter. Just don't overuse the words. I mean, I don't, probably people reading my book get sick of the word agile in there. And I just acknowledge that. I think in the forward, I'm sorry. Also the word transformation, that's overused.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't think of a better one. So what does that mean? It means I'll use the word transformation, but I won't use the transformation in places where it definitely doesn't belong. And, I'm not going to try to use the word lean or agile in places where I'm not going to have, agile shoelace tying. Or I was going to make a joke, but there is such a thing as lean coffee. But that's just an example of, just don't use the word so much, because it's eventually going to turn people off to it altogether. Kind of like how my initial reaction to Six Sigma. I had to ask somebody, why do they call it Six Sigma? And they said, well, if you look at the way that the distribution works, if you get to Six Sigma, you're down to 0.001. Okay, yeah, I get that, but why do they call it that? And then there was a stump. Like, I don't know. Well, because we're trying to get to 0.001, well, aren't trying to get to perfection? Well, shouldn't it be zero? Shouldn't that be the name of it? Shouldn't it be zero? So just be careful how you throw around terms, because you'll confuse people and make it difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it matters so much. I get irritated sometimes, I think, when people try to push on organizations to adopt something fully, because otherwise they're not doing it right. Like, Scrum is one of those things. I love Scrum. I think that it's a fine way of working, but it irritates me whenever people say things like, oh, you have to do all the things that are in Scrum in order to be doing Scrum. And my response is always, well, we're not trying to be the best at Scrum. We're trying to build the best product.
Well, the two things I always say when somebody says that, so it's called agile. It's not called rigidity.
Yeah.
And then I say, there are no Scrum police that are going to haul us away if we make a change. And implementing something because somebody put it in a spec is as stupid as somebody taking my book and trying to implement everything there dogmatically.
Yeah, I think people get too wrapped around the axle about, like, oh, well, we have to do stand-ups and we have to ask these 3 questions and we have to do it this way and it has to be time boxed to 15 minutes. Like, well, no, you don't have to do any of those things. You could just do what works for your organization. Figure out what works for my team. Right?
Well, the core part of this chapter is to understand the difference between the philosophy and the methodology. Mm-hmm. And part of the premise of the book is that you can change the methodology. That's not a problem. But you can't change the principles because they don't change.
Right.
So if you say, I don't like communication, I'm not going to communicate. Well, I can't change the results that are going to happen from you not communicating. That's just those consequences are going to occur without me doing anything. I don't have to punish you. You're going to punish yourself. Yeah. But how you implement a specific portion of one methodology, you might change it. It might do great things. You might change it. It might do bad things. So that depends on how, your organization works. And, in the last section of the book, I get into the methodologies, and I think I really overblow the concept of, customization is required. And if it makes you feel any better, of the 20, 25,000 companies doing SAFe, none of them have implemented all of it.
Yeah, I don't think there are very many companies that have adopted any of these Agile frameworks that are actually using the whole Agile framework. There may be a few that are doing Scrum the way that Scrum prescribes, but it's like, even in the success cases that I've read about, the organizations that effectively utilize some form of Agile, they don't even call it Agile. It's just the way that they do things. They just have figured out, okay, well, we're gonna communicate this way. We're gonna be transparent in this way. We're gonna, look back on our learning and try to figure out how to move forward in this way. We don't necessarily have to call them stand-ups and retrospectives and reviews and have them, at specific times within a 2-week period. But that's what they're doing, right? They are doing those things. They're just not saying, yeah, we're time boxing these things and placing them specifically within a.
Well, to use our Six Sigma terminology, there's a bell curve out there.
Mhm.
And some people are rigid on one way how they implement everything to the T, and some people are very loose on the other end, and the majority of people are somewhere in the middle. One of the phrases that's been bouncing around for a while that seems to be gaining a lot of popularity is ways of working. They abbreviate it to WOW. This is our wow, which is really cute. But I would say that to a certain extent, there are too many companies that boast of their use of Agile just to boast about it.
Mm-hmm.
There are many that do it because they don't know what else to do. And many do it because they see that it's better than what they did before. And there's many that are a combination of all three.
Mm-hmm.
And even within an organization, you walk over to one part and they're doing it a little bit differently than they're doing it in a different part. But if I were to make one generalized statement, I would say the biggest mistake that all of them are making, they're not using accountability right. I mean, if you think about all the different places you've been and all the varieties of implementations and operating that you've seen, how many had the right leadership in at the right meetings at the right time?
Very small percentage.
If they would just fix that one thing, then the rest would be 10 times better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think the leadership aspect is greatly overlooked. I think we might have talked about this in the last.
We'll talk about it probably every week.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
no matter what a company does, if they don't appropriately include their leadership, they're not going to get the full benefit, because you can't have accountability if you don't have leadership involvement. If you don't have your objectives defined well, then people can't make correct decisions. Right now,
it is leadership, right? Like, you have to lead the people.
Now, what did you say just 20 minutes ago? Agility is, two big things: making decisions based upon the latest information and having, distributed accountability. Without leadership, you can't have either of those two things, no matter what else you do. So we have the Lean and Agile Primer or Primer. That's the Primer's the antiquated pronunciation. And sometimes I like to, speak like I'm in the 19th century. But in this chapter, I don't mention leadership, I don't think anywhere. If I don't recall, I do. But if you don't have the right leadership, then you can't have in a certain sense, you can have lean without direct leadership, as long as because like in a manufacturing floor, they're working within their sphere of influence. You don't necessarily need a lot of leadership involved, but still, to make it work right, you need leadership asking for the right kinds of improvements. And then holding them accountable to deliver. But to a certain extent, lean only can survive without that regular interaction, like pure lean. But we're talking agile in this book.
That was one of the things that that I learned when I was in the military, was the concept of delegated authority, right? So in order for me to effectively do the job that I had to rely on the enlisted people that were, lower ranked than I was, to be able to not only fulfill the roles that they were, or do some of the jobs that I was being asked to do, but I had to give them the ability to do those jobs in the way that they saw fit. If I tried to say, okay, today we're going to go out, like as an example, we're going to go strip and wax the hallway, right? Take all the wax off the floor and put new wax down. If I tried to go out there and say, okay, now we're going to put down all the stripper first, and we're going to take all that old wax off. So go ahead and do that, and then come get me whenever you're done. Like, what's the difference between me doing that every single, step, guiding them every single step, and me actually just doing it? I'm not really saving myself any time. I'm not providing any, guidance to them or allowing them to grow in any way if I'm directing them every single step. But if I delegate the authority to them and I say, we have to strip and wax the P-ways, it's got to be done by the end of next week. Make sure that they all get done.
That's the whole basis for the next chapter. How to teach the people in the company to make the decisions and make choices on their own without you being involved. And I would think the smartest thing I've ever said, I developed before I ever heard there was such a thing as Agile, and that is that a manager's job is to do whatever he or she needs to do for the people below them to be successful. Right? Your job, a lot of times people say your job is to make your boss look good. I heard that as a kid, right? But throw that out. The boss's job is to make the employees successful, period. Because like you say, if they weren't there, you'd have to do it. So, and your job isn't just to give them a list of to-do items. If that was the case, we just hire robots. Your job is to make them better employees and to make the situation sustainable, so that if you are not around, the company still goes and it's can do well. And eventually you probably are going to move on either to a new position in the company or to a different company, and someone's going to have to fill that role and be ready for it. So it might be you have to do some political stuff behind the scenes. You might have to shield them from political stuff so they don't get distracted. It means you have to make sure they have the budget for the things they need to do. They have the training, the support, the instruction in some cases, because they don't know how to do things. Your job is to make sure they can be successful. That's it. Anything less than that is just superfluous. Anything more than that, I guess, is a better way to say it.
All right. So is there anything else that that you wanted to pull out of this chapter? I think that's all the
I think
questions.
I think I had a couple of quotes in there that I really like. The one from Dale Carnegie I really like that says that if you're not in the process of becoming a better person, or I would say company,
Mhm.
or becoming the person that you want to be, then you're automatically engaged in becoming the person you don't want to be. And a lean person would say, if you're not improving the process, then the process is making you worse.
Yep.
And then I would say that the smartest thing I said in this chapter, I think in my evaluation, is good companies measure themselves against the industry, but great companies measure themselves against what their customer needs.
Mhm.
And that means not only you have to make an effort to find out what your customer really needs. We get into that in a later chapter called jobs theory. But it also means that it doesn't really matter how you if you're number one in the industry, you still might not be good enough for the customer. For example, we get in a lot of detail on some stories about that, like with Nokia, how they were by far the number one company in the mobile phone industry 20 years ago, but they still fell apart and died because they weren't what the customer really wanted.
Mhm.
At least they weren't what the customer wanted 2 or 3 years later.
I remember those old commercials where they had the phones. There was like thousands of phones on like a football stadium or something, and they were all lighting them up. You know.
Yeah, well, that job could be done with a lighter.
Yeah.
So the anyway, yeah, so this chapter, again, it's kind of boring. Sometimes the boring stuff's really important, but it does provide the terminology and the concept. And if you don't, the one thing to take away from the chapter, if you want to skip it, is that the philosophy and the methodology are two different things. You know, we're going to get into the whole concept of the fact and the principle and the policy. The Agile and Lean are a set of principles. Scrum and Kanban and SAFe and all those other things out there, those are a set of policies.
Yeah.
You can change the policies. You can invent the policies. You can create a whole new set of policies. You can't change the principles. So make sure when you're developing your methodology, you want one that reinforces the principles and doesn't get in their way.
I like the quote from Dale Carnegie because, like, I keep thinking about it, and it's one of those things that I think applies well to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different industries, if you were. But the the idea is that it's not too dissimilar from like working out, right? If you're not constantly trying to push yourself just a little bit harder, then you can't lift the same weight all the time. If you lift the same weight all the time.
There's a really good Hugh Nibley quote about that later in the book.
Oh yeah.
About horizons. Either you're pushing it out or it's coming in.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
But I think it's funny that whenever we talk about analogies, I go to surfing, you go to weightlifting. So people
Yep.
can see what's important to our lives.
Yep. It's a lot of fun. I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you was the kind of along these lines. I've heard a lot of people talk about using Scrum and Kanban in their own personal lives. Do you do this?
I do. All right. So Monday morning, I have my planning meeting. I use a strange combination of Scrum and Kanban. I don't go the effort of having two separate boards, but I estimate my stories. A typical week for me is about 375 points, depending upon how well I am and how lazy I am or not lazy that week. I can get all the way up to my highest I've had in the last year. I got all the way up to 422 points. I think it was my high. My low, when a week when I was really sick, I was down to like 300 points of completed work. Now I do this on a weekly basis, but I will also try to add flexibility in there. So if something important comes along during the week, for example, my wife says, oh, we need to go do this, then I can't just say, sorry, you weren't there at my planning meeting at 5 o'clock in the morning on Monday, so I can't do that. That would be a really bad choice. I make sure that when I do my planning at the beginning, I leave some space, anticipating that things will come in a Kanban method. I put it up. I use a software Kanban board to track everything. Yesterday, I forgot about a phone call. Guess why I forgot about it? Because I didn't put on my Kanban board.
Mhm.
So, I'm far from perfect, but if it wasn't for this, I would be not as productive as I am. Now, I think I could be successful with just a to-do list also, but the thing about the Kanban board that really works well is that it focuses in on completing work, not just doing stuff.
Right.
So, on a task list, you keep track of the small little tasks. Excuse me, but on my Kanban board, I have things kind of defined as results. So, for example, I have one that says, complete the podcast, not just, contact you and see if we can make things work.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my personal life, I don't have control over everybody, and my children don't work for me, so I don't have the ability to schedule all their time as they get older. And so I might have something on there like talk to my son on Friday, and on Thursday he might say go to my friends on Friday night. Well, I'm not going to say you have to stay home from your friends because I had on my board I have scheduled to talk to you. It means I didn't plan very well. I should have, tried to talk to him earlier in the week. So I have a lot of stories that don't get finished because I didn't plan enough flexibility into it.
Well, that's
Now,
cool.
the other thing is that personal life work means I'm scheduling, 10 or 12 hours a day. Well, there were a lot of variables going on. Anything from a neighbor calling up saying, I need some help, or anything, right? Somebody from church saying, come on down, take care of this.
Mm-hmm.
Or, my child being sick, needing to go to the doctor. Well, I'm not going to say, sorry, my Kanban board doesn't have that.
We'll have to wait till next week.
Yeah, my next sprint starts on Monday. I can take you to the doctor then. That's why, even if I think I have 400 points of work available in the coming week, I would only schedule 375 or 350, anticipating there's going to be some stuff that comes in that I'm going to have to do anyway.
Well, that's interesting. Very cool. I've tried to do that a couple of different ways. I've never been successful at maintaining it for very long for personal stuff, because there's just
now, because it's in my personal, when I am coaching a team at work, the goal is to get to 100% completion. Mm-hmm. Right, and any variation of 100% completion, I really jump in on the retrospective to find out why didn't we get there and what can we learn to do better. In my personal life, there's just too much variability that my goal is 80% completion, which means I really, I'm trying to get higher. I'm trying to average 80%. I want to get to 100, but I've never seen it in my personal life. And it's because things happen.
Yeah.
Outside my control, completely outside my control. But I want to make sure that then you have to get into some real thought-provoking prioritization. How do I make sure that the same important thing doesn't get missed every week, that 20% I don't get to? Mm-hmm. And how do I really make my list as only the critical things and make sure I get to all of them? I've had weeks where I got 90%, and maybe the things I missed were a walk here or a phone call there, that maybe have been out of my control. But the process makes me better at reevaluating what's important to me. The one thing I can say is that that's not the only thing I do. I also have a set of KPIs that I evaluate. So on a weekly basis, they're part of my sprint planning on Monday mornings. I look back at the previous week. Did I do my personal study? How many people did I call on a social basis? Did I, how many times, how much, my eating, did I meet my goal on my calories to try and lose weight? Did I, I track my blood pressure. I track, several other things, the things that are important. Along the way, I've, taken things out of the important list and filled in with something else, right? It's the beginning of the year when I do my objectives for the year and set goals for those KPIs, and that helps me really focus in on what's important. And by looking at the KPIs, it gives me things that go on my Kanban board.
That's awesome.
Now, am I 10 times better than I was 10 years ago? No. But
I guess
I
guess it depends on like what's the measure of the 10x improvement in your personal life, right? Is it income, or is it like sense of accomplishment or feeling of happiness that you get from the life that you have?
It gets back to that Six Sigma thing I joked about earlier. Right? I could say, well, if I didn't do any planning at all, I'd be a complete mess. Well, yeah, but if I didn't do this method, I would have used something else. It's not like it's this agile approach or nothing. And back when I did it more, traditionally, I still did some important things. I just didn't, prioritize as well as I do now. Yeah. So I evaluate it on an ongoing basis of, is the time I'm taking in this planning and reviewing process, is it as good as it could be? No. The one thing that could make it better is that, I haven't been able to work it out. It would be much better is if when I reviewed the end of the week, is if I brought my wife in to be my product owner or my stakeholder, to report to her to say, this is what I plan to do this week, and this is what I finished, and these are the things I didn't finish, and this is why I didn't finish it. If I report it to her, I would think I would start to get that 10x improvement. But I could get my stakeholder to give me some feedback on some things that she thinks I can improve on, that I should prioritize in my backlog. I think that's how I get it. The only problem is the time I have available to do my planning is the time that she's not available. I've tried different times. I've had like start and stops, but that's the one thing that's really missing. And again, what did we talk about earlier? It's the leadership and accountability that really make everything work. And that's the one piece I don't have where it should be.
Yeah.
So now you know a lot about my internal private life. But it just goes to the point that the principles as they work in the business world work in your personal life too, or in this case, don't work.
Yeah. Well, all right. So chapter 5 is going to be about principle-based decisions. What can we expect in this chapter?
To a certain extent, this is the one chapter you should read. If you only read one chapter, that's the one. If you can take that approach and teach it to the people that work for you and around you, then your company and your personal life will be so much better. Everything else is kind of an appendage to that chapter in the book. Now that you have these principles, now that you know how to make decisions, let's give you some structure to look at this kind of decision. Now let's give you some structure to look on this kind of decision. Later in the book, we said, now let's teach you about this principle and this principle so you can make good decisions. So yeah, as boring as this week was, next week is really good.
Well, I don't think it was boring, but we'll look forward to the next conversation in about a week or so.
Yeah, and again, not to tease it too much, but of all the classes you've had in and around Agile stuff, I mean, this is not pre-scripted, but have they ever spoken about those things that are in the next chapter?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think. let me look through the chapter here real quick. I mean, I've heard some of these things probably from you, honestly. But I don't think I've ever gotten them in a class.
Yeah, and that's
except for
and,
maybe this fact one, you can't have everything.
well, that the fact one is just an example. The point is that a lot of people, most of the courses you're going to get, most of the books you're going to read are all about the methodology.
Yeah.
And the next chapter talks about how do you make decisions regardless of what methodology you're using or not using.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand that, then people are left to leaning on the methodology because they don't feel like they have the tools to make decisions on their own.
I think the first class that I had with my the CSPO class that I took was led by Chet Hendrickson. He was one of the key people in the development of XP, and he talked about how I think that was probably the first time I'd ever heard the quality triangle. Right? You can have it good, cheap, or fast, and you can pick two of those, but you can't have all three. That's probably the first time I heard that. But he always said, do what works and don't do what doesn't work.
Well, that's the 30,000 foot.
Mhm.
Chapter 6 is going to be more of the sea level.
Yeah.
And again, it's the topic is so huge. Could be several gigantic books, but I think I narrowed it down to the essence of, and as a coach, so again, we're getting a little bit of a preview for next week, and I'll probably say the same thing next week. As a coach, that's probably the wisest thing I say to people, right? They say, well, what should I do? And I ask, what principles apply to the situation? And when they list off the principles that apply, then usually I don't have to say anything. And they say, oh, I know what to do. That's all I have to say. But usually, like you said earlier, in a rigid methodology environment, they do the thing they do next is because that's what was scripted they're supposed to do.
Right.
Well, I mean, obviously, that's nice. Having a bad plan is better than having no plan at all, to quote Peter Thiel. But it's better if you teach people how to make their plans for themselves.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess that's it.
All right. Well, we'll get to this next chapter, and we'll see you all in about a week.
Bye, Zach.